So we do want to welcome on the line Mr. Jan B. Tucker. Thank you for joining us again, sir.
All right, it's a pleasure, Scotty.
Well, I do want to let the listeners know we have been reaching out to some people who I think have a lot of information and knowledge to share as we try to make this the most informative broadcast and podcast possible. And Mr. Tucker has agreed to become a weekly contributor to this broadcast. So I want to thank you for that, Mr. Tucker, for accepting that invitation.
Well, it's my pleasure, absolutely.
Now, you sent me some information that you thought our listeners would be interested in hearing, and it was certainly interesting to me. But you proposed that we talk about voter intimidation. As I stated at the top of the broadcast, before the election, we were hearing about all these different employers saying that, well, if President Obama is reelected, then I'm going to have to fire you. I'm going to have to lay you off. And I think I heard personally about two different employers who state that. But in reading your blog and people can go to your website. That's jantucker.com, jantucker.com.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Right. It's janbtucker.com.
I'm sorry. I forgot to add the B. That's janbtucker.com. Very informative blog. I think you should add it to one of your favorites. But in reading your blog, you were stating that something occurred in California with a representative as well. But I'm going to let you go ahead and kick off this topic. Why did you think it was important for us to discuss this tonight?
Yeah, well, and of course everyone's heard the news about, what happened in the presidential race with employers saying they were going to lay people off. And in fact, after the fact, several employers did follow through on their threats, as has been publicly reported. Now, in California, over the last not one but two election cycles, this issue came up even more dramatically in Laura Richardson, who was a member of the Black Congressional Caucus, and represented the Long Beach, Compton, and Lakewood areas in Congress out here. In 2010 and in 2012, she wound up getting brought up on ethics charges by the Congressional Ethics Committee because she was coercing her own employees into working on her campaign, which is a violation of federal law. Her district director, Sam Hill, who's the husband of a judge, was working right in her congressional office and, conducting all sorts of operations on her behalf for the campaign. If you work on a congressional staff, you can't work on the campaign at the same time, and certainly not while you're on congressional payroll. And other employees, including people, her staff back in Washington D.C., wound up getting fired and threatened and having pay docked for refusing to work on her campaign. Others acceded to that and later, complained, and all these wound up as ethics charges. Now, California, where a lot of this took place, has its own independent laws that go all the way back to 1937. And in California, it's actually a misdemeanor to try to coerce or influence or attempt to coerce or influence your employees by means of threat of discharge or loss of employment. And as the law puts it, to adopt or follow or refrain from adopting or following any particular or line of political action or political activity. Now, California is one of the strongest laws on the books. Most states don't have laws anywhere near that strict. Whereas the federal law, in the Voting Rights Act, for example, Section 11B, says no person, whether acting under color of law or otherwise, shall intimidate, threaten, or coerce or attempt to intimidate, threaten, or coerce any person for voting or attempting to vote, or intimidating threatening, coercing, attempting to intimidate, threaten, or coerce any person for urging or aiding any person to vote or attempt to vote, blah, blah, blah. That becomes a crime under federal law. But unfortunately, my concern is that if someone were actually prosecuted for that in the current situation that we see nationally, where you've got these threats, if one gets elected, that you've got a built-in criminal defense right in court, and that, well, they weren't saying you can't vote; they're just telling you to vote, a particular way.
Or implying it, because I don't think they ever said, you got to vote for Romney, or you got to vote for Gary Johnson, or Jill Stein. I think from what I've read, and you may have some other information, is that they stated that if President Obama wins re-election, I'm gonna fire you.
Exactly, that's precisely the point. And if we were to start a national campaign to amend the Voting Rights Act and or the Civil Rights Act, dealing with employment, to incorporate the same language that California has on the books, that would put a real crimp in these employers trying to pull that stunt ever again.
Well, what about the National Voter Registration Act of 1993?
Well, you have the same basic problem in that, what it's saying is that you have to try to prevent someone, in essence, from voting.
Okay.
And they were never saying don't vote. They're trying to say vote. You should vote the way we want you to vote.
Right.
Most of what I do is criminal offense. So thinking on how putting myself in the place of a criminal defense lawyer or a criminal defense investigator, the first thing I'm going to do is come back and say, "Oh, we have no objection to them voting. We were just using our free speech, to our position and what we thought might happen." Now, that's obviously a crock, but it's still very intimidating, and that's why I think we need to, look at amending these laws to put in very explicit language. See, the 1937 legislature in California was elected wake of Roosevelt's 1936 a landslide victory. And a lot of the people who got elected to the legislature had been part of Upton Sinclair's campaign that was called Ending Poverty in California. Upton Sinclair had been a joint candidate of the Democrats and the Socialists in 1934, a couple of years earlier. And back then it was very common to intimidate people. If they saw you going into a polling place, with literature from, a Democrat or a socialist or a communist or whatever, you'd actually have people from employers checking you out and checking you off a list, and the next day you're going to get fired. So, the 1936 legislature that got elected immediately got to work being real into the law, prevent that from ever happening again in California.
And so you're saying that we need to strengthen these federal laws. Considering the state of Congress today, the makeup of Congress, do you think that's feasible? Do you think something like that could get pushed through?
Current Congress? We've seen a lot of cases where you introduce a bill not because it's going to pass immediately, but because you want to build a campaign around it.
Right.
For example, Ron Dellums, currently mayor of Oakland, formerly congressman for many years from the Oakland area in California. Dellums introduced for years and kept going, and later Barbara Lee, who succeeded him, kept it going, a bill called the Dellums National Health Service Act, which would really have established socialized health care controlled by elected boards of people at the local level and the workers in the healthcare industry to, as the method of making sure that everyone in the United States was covered by health care. And they campaigned around that and campaigned around that and campaigned around that, knowing that version would probably never get passed. And eventually, the movement that they created around that bill led to other people coming up with solutions like, what's been called single payer and what we now eventually have emerging, as the Affordable Care Act, that Congress did finally get passed. It wasn't the best thing, but that whole movement that led to we did get started as a result of people rallying around that original legislation from Ron Dellums. And a lot of the things that Dellums actually had in his original concept did make its way into the final Affordable Care Act.
I understand. So it's not necessarily looking to get something pushed through, but to build a national conversation and public awareness about this issue.
Exactly. And, if we get someone to introduce a bill like that, obviously it's going to come from the Democratic side. There's no way it's going to come from the Republican side. Or for that matter, maybe even Bernie Sanders of Vermont, the socialist independent out of Vermont, who's actually I met Bernie back in '72 when they used to call it Bernie Barefoot Sanders because his shoes were actually in tatters while he was campaigning up and down the state. If we got someone like Bernie to introduce a bill like this, again, a national movement could be created, and you've got an instant constituency for it because there are probably hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people who are already threatened about this in the last election. And they already know it's a reality. Mm-hmm. They already know it's not going to go away. And those kind of people would be the natural constituency to go out and build a movement around it to make sure that their jobs are safe and that their employers are going to face jail time if they try to intimidate people again.
Now, there are other things that I think would fall under voter intimidation, and I'd like to get your opinion on that. I know you probably heard about the billboards in Ohio that were targeting black voters, that was talking about, it's a federal crime to participate in voter fraud or stuff like that. You heard about that case?
Oh, exactly.
Would you consider that voter intimidation?
It is. The big problem is if they're effectively saying something that's true.
Okay.
You probably the Supreme Court to uphold a law that's going to ban precisely that. On the other hand, it's probably going to be sure as hell possible. To get some kind of disclosure requirement on these groups. We've seen all this abuse, of these major PACs, mm-hmm. Political action committees, the so-called super PACs and everything, funding these things. We've seen serious abuse with so-called nonprofits, 501c4s, being used basically to launder money. To put up billboards and things of that nature. Mm-hmm. And, because the 501c4s are in essence the, incorporated state by state, there is a mechanism at the state level to rein in what they're allowed to do to achieve their nonprofit status in individual states, even if Congress isn't going to touch it.
Would you say that voter intimidation is the same thing as voter suppression?
Oh, absolutely. It just arose by any other name.
Right.
Obviously they used to do it in the South by murdering civil rights workers. They can't get away with that anymore, so they're just using more sophisticated techniques to do it. Using mechanisms that if they're legal, they're barely legal. Mm-hmm. Frequently just resorting to things that are illegal. Look at this whole scandal that's now come out where the former state chairman of the Republican Party in Florida is now blowing the whistle. They actually got the bill through the legislature And he's coming out saying, yeah, it was completely motivated, to suppress minority voter participation. Now, one of the things that we also need to look at is the immunity of legislators from civil rights suits. Generally speaking, the courts have held under the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act that you can't personally sue the actual legislators that are passing these laws. And just as with judges, you can't sue a judge under the Civil Rights Act unless what they do is completely outside of the scope, course, and scope of their judicial role. Otherwise they have absolute immunity on these things.
Even criminal?
Well, for example, the only case I know of where the Supreme Court allowed a judge to be sued was when he set his bailiff down to get a cup of coffee from a street vendor, and then didn't like the taste of the coffee, so he had his bailiff bring the guy in so he could berate him. He had obviously no authority legally to do that, but he did it anyway. But even when a judge was coercing women to have sex with him in exchange for leniency, because the Supreme Court actually ruled that you couldn't sue that judge personally under the Civil Rights Act. Well, the same kind of thing goes for legislators. They have, minimally, they have qualified immunity. You have to prove that what they individually did, is completely outside the scope of their legislative function. Well, passing laws is their legislative function. And even if they do it in bad faith, generally speaking, they're going to get away with it and be immune from civil lawsuit. So, again, we need to look at making it explicit that state legislators are not immune. When they pass something that turns out to be intentionally a violation of the Federal Voting Rights Act.
And I think that's one of the major reasons why we see so much corruption in government is because of this immunity that they get. I mean, what's the deterrent? If they get caught and they get, lose the next election, and, more than likely they will become lobbyists for, XYZ corporation. But, when I'm looking at this in the terms of ALEC, I forget the name of the what the acronym stands for, but ALEC was a conservative organization and will have conferences and invite all these different state legislators from the GOP, where they would come together and put together what they call model legislation, and then it's pretty much cookie cutter. Then they just take it to their respective states and introduce it. I mean, that's like a grand conspiracy.
Yeah, and a lot of that was corporate funded. Some corporations have now have pulled their funding of ALEC, because of the adverse publicity. But, one thing that's inherently suspect, of course there are always trade groups that are going to try to come up with model legislation, from their own perspective.
Okay.
But they're, usually when you're going to have model laws that are legitimate, they're created by the actual functional trade groups of the governmental agencies. For example, in the security industry, you have NASR, the National Association of Security Industry Regulators, which are actually the bureaus that regulate security and investigation and collections and things like that in the actual state governments. So when, they come up with a concept, for example, in California, we came up with a concept of reciprocity. So if I have an investigation that starts here in California and then it leads me to another state, that I can cross state lines without having to get licensed in that state if that state has a reciprocity law. So that was actually originated by our industry trade group. We brought it to NASR, to the Irregulators Trade Group, and got them to pass it as a model law. That's a legitimate way of looking at it. If you actually have the government industry association look at it, and go through its normal process of getting public comment and things like that. But these trade groups that that are simply funded by major corporate entities and go around the government entities, they develop the model legislation and then have the state legislatures pass it directly. Those are inherently suspect. Those are inherently going to be biased.
Mm-hmm. Because they're coming from a special interest group. Yeah, I certainly agree with you there. I tell you, this republic is far from perfect. Lots of things, lots of work needs to be done. As we get ready to wrap up this segment, again, just to let the listeners know, we appreciate Mr. Jan Tucker for coming on, and he's going to be a regular weekly contributor to this program. I think his blog is great. Again, you can go to his blog, Jan B. Tucker. That's Jan B as in boy, Tucker.com. It will really inform you as it does me. So as we get ready to wrap up this segment, what would you leave the listeners with on this particular topic?
Well, one of the other hats I wear is I'm state director of the California League of Latin American Citizens, and I'm going to be bringing this issue to our national organization, National League of Latin American Citizens. Now, we say, of course, we're representing Latin American citizens. We're really very ecumenical, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm not Latino myself. I'm not black, but I've been a member of the NAACP for years. We want to start a national movement around these issues, and I'll be bringing that to NLLAC. I mean, I invite everyone to get a hold of me if they're interested out there in your listening audience. You can reach me through the website, janbtucker.com, and or the blog, janbtucker.com/blog. And I look forward to hearing you if you want to get involved in a national campaign like that.
It does seem like something that, especially from this last election and going back to the 2008 election, there were more than a couple of cases of voter intimidation. And, not people should be writing their legislators now, I believe, in raising this issue and not, waiting on this or that organization to raise the issue first. But they could do that right now, contact their legislatures about this. And then, of course, they can keep up with the group that you are involved with and, can then send that information to their legislator. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
All right, well, Mr. Tucker, I want to thank you again for becoming part of the Black Talk Radio family, and I can't wait to speak to you again next week. And with that stated, you have a very, very blessed week.
You too. Thanks so much. Bye.